time for our first interstate guest to set the scene with the big picture of regeneration. Dr. Terry McCosker is one of the great innovators of Australian agriculture and has been recognised with many awards, including an honorary doctorate in agribusiness, and an OAM. One of Terry's greatest lifetime achievements has been to effectively bridge the gap between the contesting paradigms of traditional agriculture and regenerative agriculture, helping to ensure the long-term survival of Australian agriculture generally and its farming families. Terry is an internationally acclaimed teacher and has worked in research, extension and property management in both government and private sectors for over 55 years. In his research phase in the 80s, Terry published over 40 papers and made several world-first discoveries. And he was honoured last year in an unforgettable scenes, really, that I was privileged to be a part of at the 30th anniversary RCS Convergence in Brisbane. RCS being the organisation Terry founded that so many have worked with. Please give him a massive hand, Dr. Terry McCosker.
Thank you, AJ, and thank you, Tracy. I think you stole half my thunder in your opening speech there. All right, let me kick off. I think my view is that unless we understand where we've come from, it's a bit hard to understand where we're headed. So I'm going to give us a little bit of a history lesson, look at where we are today, and then look at where I think the future might lie. I'd like to start off by asking for a show of hands. Who has ever heard of Albrecht von Thayer? Oi, plenty of people, fantastic. And who's heard of Justus Liebig? Well, actually, more people have heard of von Thayer than Liebig, or just about the same, which is fantastic. So von Thayer published his first books, 4 volumes actually, on the principles of agriculture, about 1808, I think it was, or 6, 1809 to 1812. And his principles of agriculture were actually holistic, and it was based on geology, biology, economics, and a whole range of things which were very, very new back in that era. And then along in the 1940s, Liebig published his book, Organic Chemistry and its Application to Agriculture. And that actually changed the course of history. And so if we look at these two guys now, we can go back to the 1850s and see that there was a split between basically what you would call holistic agriculture and industrial agriculture. And industrial agriculture and industrial medicine started with von Liebig. And we'll get to some of the reasons why that happened. So we can go way back, and 170 years ago, there was a change. By the time those two were German guys, obviously, and by the time we get into the early 1900s, German farmers were concerned about where the industrial agricultural shift was taking them. So they went to this guy called Steiner. And Steiner then wrote a book, The Agricultural Course and the Birth of Biodynamics. Steiner also wrote books on medicine. And I'm going to mention medicine quite a few times here because I think the medical paradigm and the agricultural paradigm have gone in parallel pathways since probably the 1840s, 1850s. And so then along came Smuts, who was one of the most brilliant intellectuals and minds that we've seen for a very, very long time. He was a lawyer, a botanist, a general, a president of South Africa, and so on. And he had a concern about where the reductionist approach to everything was taking us, and he wrote his book, Holism and Evolution, published in 1926. And there are lots of people that have picked up on Smuts' work since, and I think that still is there's underlying principles established by Smuts that are a substantial part of where we are today in regenerative agriculture. In about 1906, Sir Albert Howard, who wasn't knighted in those days, started work in India as a cotton agronomist. And his job in India was to help the industrial ag paradigm grow cotton. And because he was up against fairly quickly problems with pests and diseases. But Howard noticed that some of the traditional Indian farmers didn't have the same problems. And one of his classic experiments was he took some buffalo on Indian farms, and then buffalo that he took with rinderpest and put them across the fence on conventional farms. That rinderpest did not cross the fence and go into the buffalo on the traditionally run farms. And that indicated to him that there was something going on in those traditional farms that was different to what was happening in what he had learnt and what he was working on. So he switched his focus for the rest of his life on what was happening. He went to China and he studied what had Chinese farmers who'd been farming for 6,000 years, what were they doing that enabled them to continue to farm for that long? And so he created what became organic agriculture. Organic agriculture to Howard was about organic matter and organic carbon and humus in soils. It wasn't about a brand. And so he published his first book in 1940. Following him was Lady Eve Balfour, and she was a real character. She was a musician. She was a pilot before the Second World War, which was quite amazing for a woman to be a pilot back then. She was also a farmer at the age of 22, which was also quite amazing for a woman to be a farmer back then. And eventually she ran into all sorts of problems with the industrial ag system. And then she met Albert Howard and started to follow his work and his principles. She founded the British Soil Association, but she also set up an amazing experiment called the Hawley experiment, which went for 20 years, where she compared two farms. An organic farm, and organic back then meant focus on soil organic carbon. And the only difference between that farm and the one right next door was that the one next door was allowed to use fertilisers, chemical fertilisers. And that chemical fertiliser started back in the 1880s, 1870s. And so what she found over 20 years, one of the findings of that experiment was that over 20 years, the milk production off the organic farm was 15% higher over the 20-year period. And the only change was the introduction of chemical-based or salt-based fertilisers. So she also followed Smuts, and then along came Rodale, and this is where organics went wrong. Rodale was one of the founders of the organic movement, and organics suddenly became about lack of chemicals instead of about soil health. And that's what we know organics as today. So even organics and that process, I believe, was corrupted in a way, and I know that Howard, and when you read some of their work, Howard and Balfour were very concerned that the organic movement had actually moved away from its roots, which was soil organic matter. His son, incidentally, coined the phrase regenerative agriculture back in 1980. William Albrecht was another great, and he started out mostly from a veterinary perspective. He was a biologist. His first degree was actually a liberal arts degree, and somehow or other he ended up in soils. But he ended up there because he saw that some animals on some farms were doing quite well, and other animals on other farms were not producing and they weren't performing. Albrecht went back to the soil to find the answers, and that's where the answers lay. And so he's probably best known for his work on soils. I love his little statement on the bottom that food is fabricated soil fertility. And so he was able to link food, animal performance, and even human health back to soil health. One of the other greats for me has been Andre Voisin, also an incredible guy with an incredible mind. He started as a biochemist. He then trained as an engineer. He was a naval engineer leading up to and at the beginning of the Second World War. When France fell in the Second World War, he went back to France and fought in the resistance. And after that, he needed a break, so he went back to his farm and then went back to biochemistry. And I like the fact that in 1959, he published a book called Soil, Grass and Cancer. And it's a fascinating book. If you get hold of it, there's some real good implications in there, how to avoid it. The guy beside him is Fidel Castro. And Voisin actually was visiting Cuba, and 4 days after that photograph was taken, died of a heart attack. And Fidel Castro actually delivered the eulogy, and Voisin today is still buried in Cuba. So, and again, an amazing intellect that's given us, particularly in the grazing industry, a lot to think about. Another guy who's been very instrumental and is Charles Walters. And Charles Walters was a journalist, but what he did was enable a lot of what are known then as biological farmers and people and biological science to come out of the closet. And so he actually got a lot of books published and a lot of well-known names today. People like Neil Kinsey, Arden Anderson, Gary Zimmer, etc., were all people that were kicked off and supported by Charles Walters. And so he was also a great pioneer in our world. These two guys were probably two of the most influential in my journey, and particularly Stan Parsons on the left. And Parsons and Savory were partners for 13 years, and it was their combined intellect that pulled together a lot of what we do today and a lot of what's in the holistic training as well today. And so I believe the world owes those two a debt of gratitude, and their combined intellect a debt of gratitude. And so we've got Gabe speaking a little bit later, and we start to move up to now. And one of the biggest influences on me today is this young guy. And I class him as the world's leading integrative agronomist. What he doesn't know about agronomy and plant production is not worth growing. And he finished, I don't think he ever finished school, but he's got an absolutely amazing intellect and an amazing knowledge and global reach. So we've still got this great divide, and you can see these old guys through history still staring down at each other from both sides of this divide. And you've got William Albrecht sitting in the middle with a quizzical look on his face saying, what are you guys up to? You know, you're actually all got something to add. You've all got something that's right. What we need to do is get the balance right. And so that leads us to the present. So industrial agriculture is the clear adoption winner globally. And basically that goes right back to von Liebig. There's only 5.1% of corn soy land in the US that's under cover crop, despite the fact that 45% of farmers are playing around with it. That indicates to me that there's a shift coming. Right? There's a lot of people playing, but they're not quite there yet, but it's underway. So there's a shift underway. But industrial agriculture has got a lot of advantages. It's got clear technology and science, and very deep technology and science, impressive mechanisation. There's support systems, knowledge and R&D in the industrial system that we could only hope for, or even to get a part of in the regenerative movement. Huge depth of experience, and it's created a lot of wealth. So there's a lot of strengths and a lot of ability there. But there's problems appearing. There's cracks appearing in the system. And this is Canadian data, and it, to me, tells part of the story of some of the cracks in the system. So the top line there is gross revenue. The black line is gross revenue from farms. And you can see this goes back a long way, this data set. Across the bottom, just above the green line there, that is net farm income. The blue bit in the middle is the amount of money that goes into input manufacturers. And if I put that in context, over a 32-year period, agribusiness captured 98% of farmers' income. You know, Savory has a saying that when you go around wearing the cap that's got John Deere on it or somebody else, you're using your own head to advertise somebody else's product. And it's actually very true. That should read 2023. So, you know, we go back to 1975, there were 9 weeds resistant to herbicides. Today, there's 515, and you can see that graph. It doesn't show too much sign of slowing down. That says to me that there's some significant cracks in the current paradigm that we need to figure out how to resolve, because growing crops in particular without herbicides has got its problems, it's got its issues. So, but what do we do about that? If we look at soil, so this is some very recent work from the US. So the blue stuff there, that's regenerative agriculture, soil organic matter versus industrial agriculture. You'll see a significant difference. And on the right-hand side, soil health as determined by the Haney system. Again, a significant difference between regenerative and the industrial. And in these two, there's very little difference between the two. The only difference is that the salt-based fertilisers have been pulled out, and that's called regenerative, and cover crops have been used. Only 2 changes, really, between those 2 systems. And already there's a significant difference. There's also a significant difference between those 2 in the nutrient density of the food. And you can look at a whole lot of crops there, and I'd like to draw your attention to the bottom in ones in particular, the phytochemicals. Those phytochemicals are critical for human health and animal health. And if we're losing those, and we're losing nutrient density from the plants and the food that we're producing, whether it's for animals or people, then we've got some health issues on the way. And just taking a wheat crop, because this is, you know, a wheat state, a wheat barley sort of state, you'll see the difference between the 2 in yield is 0. Both conventional and regenerative had 5 tonnes of wheat per hectare yield. But there's a significant increase in the nutrient availability in the advantage of regenerative over conventional. That's what that percentage is. And again, quite substantial in terms of nutrient density, with only a couple of minor changes really in those systems. The link between soil health and human health has been known for over 100 years. This guy here, Robert McGarrison, also started work in India at the same time as Sir Albert Howard. And they worked together over a long period of time. And one of the interesting things that McGarrison did was that he studied the diet of Indians in different parts of India. And places where they were tall, erect, healthy people, places where they were thin and small people, and people in between. He took those diets and fed them to rats and repeated the shape of the human body and the diseases in the rats that those human populations had had, and clearly indicated that the shape and the form of those humans was due to the diet that they were actually on. And in his honour, there's a McGarrison Society for Nutrition. And this last paragraph I'll read because it's on their website. He was widely published in the medical press. He was completely ignored by government and the medical profession at a time when medical thought was absorbed in the study of disease rather than on prevention of the promotion of health. And we can apply that same principle, the same thought, to the way agriculture operates as well. There was many studies way back at the beginning of the 1900s, very deep and studies. The Peckham experiment was one, and I really like this statement from their founders, that no headway could be made in the understanding of health by researchers into the nature of disease. and you think about the agriculture and medicine today, is the focus on the health or is the focus on the disease? And this little statement from Eve, it just jumped off the page in one of her books, and it said, "The human race still digs its own grave with its teeth." So true. We look at US health statistics. 60% of US adults today have at least one chronic disease. 40% have two or more chronic diseases. And where Big Brother goes, Little Brother goes. In Australia today, 40% of Australians have at least one chronic disease and 25% have two or more chronic diseases. And we know the root cause. The root cause is soil health. The root cause is nutrient density. So where are we now? So in terms of Regen Ag, we're struggling for adoption. Adoption of Regen Ag is still quite small, particularly in cropping. In grazing, I think it's much more significant. We're pushing against well-established paradigms and agribusiness. We require different inputs, some of which are not easy to find. We have poorly understood and poorly developed systems. We haven't, really developed those very well, and we require longer-term thinking to shift to Regen Ag. But there's a lot of advantages. We can at lower cost, lower risk, potential income from natural capital and things like carbon. We can support many future generations, and we can change health outcomes of populations. So let's look at increasing soil health, and AJ had already mentioned Hawkins' definition of regeneration, and I think it's so true. It means putting life at the centre of every action, and that means instead of getting out of bed in the morning as a doctor or as an agronomist or as some farmers and say, what have I got to kill today? What is it that I can make live today? And it's a simple shift. So if we improve soil health, we will improve plant health. As we improve plant health, we will be improving animal health. When we improve plant health and animal health, we will be improving the business. And it's critical that we have a successful business. We cannot be green, or be green and in the red. When we improve plant health, animal health, and often the business, human health will improve. And as we improve human health, we're going to end up with more sustainable and better communities. And so maybe we can even call that regenerative. To me, regenerative agriculture is about outcomes. I don't really care what it takes or what you do to regenerate soil, to get more nutrient density. Let's not get hung up on inputs. We really need to be focused on what we produce and the outcomes. And so if we look at how do we go forward from here, and there are several ways that we can look at things. And I want to start with simplicity. So simplicity is one way. We can look at things from a very simple perspective. And those birds there, that's a simple perspective or view of life. But when we look at agribusiness, if we take a simple perspective on it, well, maybe we've got business, we've got ecology, production and people are the four pillars of agribusiness, and they're all linked. And so that's a fairly simple view of agriculture.